You may be familiar with the 1988 film The Accused, starring Jodie Foster. Foster plays a young woman who is savagely gang essayed by multiple men in a bar, while other bar patrons watch on and cheer. After the horrific episode, Foster's character has to endure further humiliation, threats, and people just not believing her story. It's basically victim blaming at its finest. Kelly McGinnis plays the prosecuting attorney of the story, who seeks justice for the traumatized female. The studio actually wanted McGinnis to play the victim's role, but McGinnis had actually been attacked in real life by two young males not long after she moved out to New York City to try her hand at acting. She was forced into her apartment while these two monsters took turns essaying her and sodomizing her. The ordeal lasted around 20 minutes. 20 minutes of torture and pure hell. The males were 15 and 20, and the 15-year-old was actually the more scarier and more brutal of the two. The 15-year-old was arrested and convicted and served 3 years in prison. The other one, however, was arrested but was let off for lack of evidence. McGinnis decided she didn't want to recreate something like that had actually happened to her. The prosecutor of the movie was a strong female that cut through all the BS, and she fit that role perfectly. Many people may not realize that The Accused was actually based on true events, and while The Accused can be at times hard to watch, the true story of Cheryl Ann Araujo is even more disturbing. Cheryl Araujo was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts on March 28, 1961. She was of Portuguese descent, and she lived in a Portuguese-dominant neighborhood. On March 6, 1983, the then 21-year-old Cheryl had a 1-year-old baby daughter and a toddler who just got done celebrating her 3rd-year birthday. Although not married, Cheryl did live with the girl's father in their 2-room tenement apartment. That night, as tired as Cheryl was, she was out of cigarettes and decided to walk to the nearest store. When she was unable to get her preferred brand at the store, she ended up walking to Big Dan's Tavern, a local bar where she could buy cigarettes from the vending machine. While at the bar, Cheryl spoke friendly with some guys that were shooting pool, and she ordered a 7-and-7 drink. There were 10 people in the bar that night, including Cheryl. Cheryl was the only woman in the bar that night, and the guys would just circle around her like sharks, paying attention to nothing except her. While the conversation between Cheryl and the guys started off as friendly and maybe even a little flirtatious, Cheryl hadn't planned on being out very long. After all, she had 2 young children at home. When she went to leave, the men decided it was time for them to attack their prey. 2 men that had been shooting pool, Joseph Vieira and Daniel Silva, grabbed Cheryl. The men were ripping at Cheryl's jeans, trying to tug them off of her. She protested and tried to fight back. The bartender, Daniel Machado, claims to be an eyewitness to the incident, and he had said that there was 2 other bar patrons, Virelio Medeiros and Jose Medeiros, no relation, that watched the men wrestle her on the floor as they cheered them on. With the men shouting, "Do it, do it, yeah, that's it." Machado claims at that point he went towards the bar phone to call for help, but the 2 cheering men blocked his path, saying, "Where do you think you're going? You're not going anywhere." Machado says he was too frightened to try to do anything at that point. But he says he tried to give another customer change to call the police from another phone, but supposedly that customer was too intimidated to do anything either. The 2 pool players had gotten Cheryl on top of the pool table. They took turns essaying her. In addition to Vieira and Silva, 2 other men had joined in on the attack on the pool table. Their names were Victor Raposo and John Cordiero. They had taken off their pants and were trying to get Cheryl to perform oral sex on them. According to Machado, the attack went on for around 35 minutes. He also testified that Cheryl was very flirtatious towards Victor Raposo earlier in the night, hugging him and telling him how cute he was. As the vicious attack was happening, Cheryl had found an opening to escape, and she didn't hesitate. It was at a point where one guy was done with her and another guy was going to take his turn. Cheryl had leapt to her feet and ran out of the door of the bar. The men were right behind her, ready to capture her and bring her back inside. Apparently, these animals weren't done with her yet. As fate would have it, though, a van with 3 men in their early 30s were traveling down the road at that exact moment. The 3 men were Daniel Patrick O'Neill, his brother Michael, and their friend Bobby Silva. They were out for a night of bar hopping, but nothing too crazy. They were on their way home when Michael, who was dozing off, heard his brother yelling, "Naked girl in the street, naked girl in the street." Michael was shocked to look up and see that this was actually true. There were guys chasing her too, but once these guys saw that Cheryl ran up to the van where the guys were, they turned their back and retreated back to the bar. The guys in the van were kind of freaked out. They put a coat around Cheryl, who seemed like a doe in the headlights at first, but then, after she wrapped her arms around one of the men, she wouldn't let go. Michael got out of the van and picked up a pipe that was lying on the ground and started walking towards the bar where the men were, but he quickly realized he didn't know what to do if he were to go face to face with these dangerous men, so he decided to put the weapon down and he got back in the van. They ended up driving Cheryl to a Rite Aid where there was a payphone and they ended up calling the police. The police came to the store and picked her up and got the guy's statements. 6 men ended up being arrested. Victor Raposo, John Cordiero, Joseph Vieira, and Daniel Silva were all charged with aggravated SA. The other 2, Virgilio and Jose Medeiros, were charged with joint enterprise for witnessing the assault and not doing anything to render aid to the victim. They were said to have been yelling encouragement to the attackers and therefore they were complicit in the assault. They were said to have been preventing the bartender from stepping in to help. News of the assault soon made national news. Most people were horrified to hear of the gang assault against the young mother, and they were even more disturbed to learn that multiple people not only watched but cheered on the ones perpetrating the attack. There was kind of a mixed bag of emotion. While a good majority of the public felt empathy towards Cheryl, there were many people that actually defended the men and would demonize Cheryl. Think about that. Demonize the victim. All the men that were arrested were of Portuguese descent, and coverage of the case seemed to bring a lot of hate towards the Portuguese community. New Bedford was 60% Portuguese American, so instead of focusing on the traumatic ordeal that Cheryl had gone through, the case started to become all about race. The Portuguese community raised $20,000 in order to bail the accused rapist out of jail. Cheryl was actually Portuguese herself, but she started to receive backlash in her own community and elsewhere. Portuguese Americans were blaming her for their people being hated on. Cheryl was completely vilified. People were saying that she deserved what happened to her, that she had asked for it. They would say, "Why is she out at the bar late at night when she has kids at home?" Cheryl even started to receive death threats. The trial was broadcast on CNN, and it was the first of this magnitude of essay to be broadcasted on TV. Defense attorney Edward Harrington had no problem bringing up Cheryl's past and actually bringing up her sexual history and talking about her abuse of alcohol. He had no problem blaming the victim as long as it helped his client. He said, and I quote, "If you're living with a man, what are you doing running around the streets getting raped?" Cheryl's credibility also came into question because she first told police it sounded like a dozen people were in the bar cheering on the men who assaulted her. In actuality, there was only 10 people in the bar that night, and supposedly only 2 men were cheering on. One of the Medeiros actually ended up admitting, saying, "Go for it," to the attackers, but in the end, both men charged with joint enterprise were acquitted. The 4 men accused of aggravated SA were all found guilty and sentenced to between 6 and 12 years, but no one actually served more than 6.5. After the convictions, about 10,000 people marched to protest the convictions of the convicted gang rapists. New Bedford had been put on the map now. It became known as the gang rape capital of the world. Protesters would yell in the streets that she should have been home in the first place. Another person yelled that she should be hanged. After the trial, Cheryl's life only got harder. She continued to receive death threats. She couldn't even leave her home without getting harassed by people yelling at her and spitting on her. News crews would stalk her. A man called into a radio station saying that Araujo was dead meat. And it wasn't just men that were angry at the victim. Women also blamed Cheryl. Some even claimed that she was the aggressor and the instigator that night. She got what was coming to her, they said. 16,000 residents ended up signing a petition for leniency to the attackers. Cheryl's family also got harassed by people. In addition to her name being made public, so was her address. The judge of the case felt deep regret that that had happened afterwards and wished he could have done something to stop it at the time, although he did allow it. People would show up to the Araujo residence to torment the sexual assault victim, and oddly enough, the men that helped rescue Cheryl were also vilified. The judge during the trial, William Young, praised the young men for stopping to help the women that was in distress, especially when no one else seemed to be decent enough to step in. For being good Samaritans and testifying at the trial, the O'Neill brothers and Dan Silva started getting death threats among other forms of harassment. In an interview that Michael O'Neill gave more than 25 years after, he said that so many lies came out during the trial, like that she was a whore. Michael said even if she was a whore, it doesn't matter because she said no. Years after the incident, Michael would run into two women by happenstance at a New Year's Eve party. It happened to be Cheryl's sister and mother. They expressed to him how appreciative they were for what he had done for Cheryl. He did what no one else even tried to do. He saved a woman from multiple monsters coming at her. Meanwhile, you have other people defending the animals and trying to get leniency for their sentences. Cheryl was ostracized after the trial. She couldn't stay in New Bedford. The town wouldn't let her live in peace. Her and her boyfriend and their two daughters ended up moving down to Miami, Florida. She fell back into drinking and she would abuse alcohol to try to numb her pain. By 1986, she ended up in a drug and alcohol treatment facility where she stayed for over 6 months. During that time, she had time to reflect on life and think about what she really wanted to do. She decided that she was going to go back to school. She was going to study at the local community college to become a secretary. Unfortunately, though, her plans would never come to fruition. On December 14, 1986, Cheryl was driving with her two young daughters home from a Christmas show at Tropical Park when she lost control of her vehicle and crashed into a utility pole. The two girls were injured, but they would later recover. Jessica, who was not wearing her seatbelt, broke her wrist and clavicle, while Carolyn, who did have her seatbelt on, only got a few bumps and bruises. But Cheryl was killed in the collision. Investigators didn't think that alcohol was involved at first, but they couldn't have been more wrong. The medical examiner found Cheryl's blood alcohol content to be 0.29, which was almost 3 times the legal limit for operating a vehicle. Cheryl, who had survived a vicious physical attack, was now dead at 25. March 6, 1983 would forever change Cheryl Araujo's life. She essentially was attacked by multiple people while others watched on and did nothing to help her. This went on for as little as 35 minutes and as long as 2 hours. While she did have support around the country, it did not outweigh the hate towards her in her own community. To this day, we are very quick to blame the victim, which I still don't fully understand. The woman may have flirted with a guy at the bar and had as many as 3 drinks, and we're bringing that up after the man and the other men forced themselves into her. It is sickening to think of what she went through and the fact that people want to make her feel even worse while simultaneously lobbying for these rapists to be set free. It seems unconscionable. Is that the world that we live in?